Welcome to the presentation before the Missouri Flood Recovery Working Group Commission, first done on Monday, April 13th by the Missouri Coalition for the Environment, Sierra Club Missouri Chapter, and Great Rivers Habitat Alliance. The presentation regards better ways to do flood control, flood resilience, and floodplain management in Missouri. Our first slide, presented by the Sierra Club, stresses a focus on resilience, flood risk reduction, and innovation, rather than the traditional view of flood control, which depends entirely on levees. Our second point is about how to do this. We should try to leave more room for the river by setting back levees when possible, and reconnecting floodplains to their reconnecting rivers to their natural floodplains wherever possible. Setbacks, when appropriate, create a connected floodplain that used to be along the river before we build levees and other developments. This more natural connected floodplain is good for wildlife, the environment, recreation, and many other things. Our third point is that we need, as a state, to finally be serious about recognizing climate change and what it means for the lower Missouri River Basin. Climate scientists predict that Midwest areas like Missouri will get more extreme rain events. This means we'll have more storms and heavy periods of continuous rainfall in our river basins, and that is exactly what is happening. Climate change means we have to be smarter about reducing flood risk. Next slide. Our fourth point is that Missouri should involve the public and be transparent when planning for flood risk reduction. The steps we should take to reduce flood damage may cost a lot now, but will save money in the long run. We've all seen just how much money in emergency funding we've spent on flooding in recent years. We need to build support for this type of more natural spending, be it whether to raise, relocate highways, to protect facilities that cannot be moved, or to elevate homes and other structures. Also, changes may be needed in crop subsidies, wetland and conservation reserve costs. The lower Missouri River, as well as the upper Mississippi River, are not the only areas of the country needing taxpayer funds to respond to climate change impacts. Other areas of the country are also faced with hard choices. Missouri needs to develop a smarter plan which shows we are not trying to solve new problems with old, wasted, tried solutions. Next slide. A bit of history about the Missouri River Reservoir and levee system. Back in 1947, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was building the large reservoirs in the upper river basin, but the Corps knew that the reservoirs could not solve all the flooding problems in the lower river. The Corps advised that the levees built on the lower river be far back enough from the river to provide 3,000 to 5,000 foot width for river and floodplain. Unfortunately, it took many years to complete a lower river system, and many of the levees that were built much too close to the river, far less width than the recommended 3,000 to 5,000 feet. If this original plan had been followed, we would have had far fewer and far less devastating floods over the past decades. Next slide. This is a drawing of what the river might look like with a 3,000 to 5,000 foot width. In this drawing, some of the floodplain is on the left side to a bluff. On the right side, the levee is set back to leave room for floodwaters. Today, we need to think of setting back levees where we can to meet the original plan of 3,000 to 5,000 feet. And due to the increased floodwaters connected to climate change, we may need to do even more, such as was mentioned on slide 2. Next slide. This is a map of the Missouri River near Herman. The purple area shows potential farmland protected behind the levee. The red line shows what the distance might be if we set a levee back to connect a floodplain to reduce flood risk. You can see that much of the area would still be behind the levee. In fact, with the setback levee, the remaining area would be even better protected. Areas similar to this flood frequently, and levees need rebuilding year after year. But taxpayers should not be asked to pay again and again for the same levees. By setting back levees where appropriate, we could get multiple benefits of better flood protection, wildlife habitat, and a less costly system. Next slide. Slide 7 is the front page of the famous report to Congress from Charles Ellet in the 1850s. Charles Ellet was an engineer hired to look into ways to better protect the city of New Orleans from flooding. And while Charles included levees as a necessary part of that protection for the heavily populated city, he knew that there was a fundamental issue in that use of levees up and down the Mississippi River had been the primary cause of the increase in flooding, and that expanded use of levees to protect New Orleans would really only make the problem worse in the long run. Charles Ellet was right in 1852, and he's right now. Next slide. This is a picture of Winfield Lock and Dam at the height of the flooding in 2019. Obviously, you can see the enormous amount of water to the left or west of the lock and dam in the picture. You can see land that is projected to be part of the proposed Port of Lincoln project in Lincoln County, Missouri. It was all underwater then, and that project would be a devastating proposal for our state. Missouri currently has far too lax floodplain development rules. There is a difference between the floodway and the floodplain. The floodway is where the main bulk of the water in a flood is designated to go, is where nature has designated that to go. The floodplain is the area around that where the floodwaters will go off to, but not necessarily be part of the main part of the flood. You are not allowed to develop in the floodway unless you can demonstrate you're not raising the height of the water in the region at all. However, throughout the state of Missouri, with the exception of parts of Jefferson County and St. Charles County, you are still allowed to develop in the floodplain as long as you can demonstrate that you're only raising the water height by up to 1 foot. Well, 1 foot is a lot of water, and that limit has not prevented any floodplain developments in our state, to my knowledge. As we've seen in Chesterfield, Maryland Heights, St. Peters, Hazelwood, Bridgeton, and many other cities throughout Missouri, if a city and a developer want to develop in the floodplain, they're going to be allowed to do so. Last year, in 2019, Jefferson County became the first local government to reduce that 1 foot rise down to 1 inch. That will be a very beneficial change for the unincorporated parts of Jefferson County, although we've seen cities in that area, such as Eureka, now attempting to annex land in Jefferson County into their city, arguing to the property owners that they'll be able to go back to the much more lenient 1 foot rule. That more lenient rule, of course, makes flooding worse by permitting more and more floodplain development. St. Charles County, for its unincorporated areas, also has more strict floodplain development rules that was instituted a while back. They're not exactly along the lines of floodplain versus floodway sizes, but it's still a very beneficial rule. All of this evidence that floodplain development, overly constricted rivers through too many levees, and climate change is making flooding worse is backed up by significant scientific work. Work done by Professor Bob Criss, Professor Jonathan Remo, Professor Nicholas Pinter, and the late Professor Charles Belt have all proven that the majority of the floods we're seeing are man-made floods. Next slide. Policy recommendations from Great Rivers Habitat Alliance, Sierra Club, the Coalition for the Environment, and others include revising Missouri Statute 49.605, which prohibits many local governments in Missouri from tightening floodplain regulations even if they wanted to. At a minimum, local cities and local counties should be allowed to tighten floodplain rules and floodplain development limits if they choose to. Revised Statute 99.847 currently prohibits the use of tax increment financing in the floodplain within St. Charles County, and that law should be expanded to many more counties throughout the state of Missouri. Finally, Statute 99.820 gives the counties more authority on TIF, tax increment financing, or TIF decisions in St. Louis, St. Charles, and Jefferson counties. We've seen that, as happened in Maryland Heights, county-dominated commissions take a much more regional and far better approach to these types of developments, whereas cities see nothing more than looking at floodplain and imagining how many tax dollars they can generate from it. Counties have been far better at this choice, and the expansion of county authority and TIF commissions around the state should be expanded beyond St. Louis, St. Charles, and Jefferson County. Next slide. Here we have some of the many individual examples of local cities and other projects trying to develop the floodplain. Chesterfield is, of course, the poster child for what not to do after the Great Flood of 1993. They took that entire area, which was covered under probably a dozen feet of water, if not more, and thought to pave it all over and block it off from the Missouri River with newer and bigger levees. They might have made it better for Chesterfield, but they make it worse for everyone else. And that is the repeated flaw in what we do in Missouri and many other states. The Lighthouse Project in St. Louis City, north of 270, has already taken 75 acres of floodplain, removed it from the floodway, and seeks now to develop it. Along Bridgeton, Hazelwood, Maryland Heights, along the Missouri River, you have constant small, mid-size, and potentially large developments taking land out of the floodplain, which will always put other land and other people into the floodplain. And with each new levee you add into it, as they want now to do in the city of St. Charles, you're going to make the flooding worse as you constrict the rivers more. Finally, the New Madrid levee is a project in southeastern Missouri, which has thankfully been stopped so far, although the Corps of Engineers still supports it. That levee would take the last natural connection of the Mississippi River for hundreds of miles in that region, and it's a short natural connection to its floodplain, which is excellent for habitat and the environment, and it would cut that last connection off for the benefit of a few farm families in that region. Thankfully, that has been stopped as of yet, but it needs to be stopped permanently. Next slide. Tools for land acquisition that will help us connect our great rivers to their natural floodplain and help maintain our floodplain and floodway for so many environmental and public safety benefits include the Missouri River Recovery Program, the Natural Resource Conservation Service Wetlands Reserve Easement Program, the Riverlands Migratory Bird Sanctuary in St. Charles County across from Alton, Illinois, and finally the Big Muddy Fish and Wildlife Refuge in Missouri, which, like other fish and wildlife refuges, including the Great Rivers Fish and Wildlife Refuge on the Mississippi, need to be expanded to help hold floodwater in the future. Next slide. The Missouri River Recovery Program is a Corps of Engineers program. It has mitigated loss of 522,000 acres of habitat loss, where people are then required to provide mitigation to offset the damage that's been done. It's been authorized to develop 166,750 acres of land along 735 miles of the Missouri River. The program is still active and needs further land acquisition funding. The NRCS Wetlands Reserve Easement is a currently ongoing program for permanent and 30-year easements available to landowners. The NRCS pays market value and 100% of restoration costs, while the landowner retains title and property remains private. The landowner is permitted to enjoy the property and use it for for hunting and other recreational purposes. It is not used for agriculture, I don't believe. Next slide. The Riverlands Migratory Bird Sanctuary in St. Charles County, just south of Alton, Illinois. It's a joint project with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Audubon Society. 3,700 acres along the Mississippi River is preserved for wildlife, habitat, and high water flood storage. It's not currently acquiring new property, but it is a wonderful facility, and we encourage everybody in the St. Louis region to go check it out and see what they offer there. Finally, the Big Muddy Fish and Wildlife Refuge is the premier fish and wildlife refuge in the state of Missouri, 21,000 acres between Kansas City and the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. It's been authorized to acquire 60,000 acres from willing sellers, and in order to hold floodwaters in the future, we need to grow that 21,000 up to 60,000. It is open to fishing and hunting with applicable state regulations applying. It's a wonderful facility, and it too needs to be expanded. On behalf of Great Rivers Habitat Alliance, Missouri Coalition for the Environment, and the Sierra Club Missouri chapter, we thank you for viewing this presentation. On this last slide, you have contact information for all organizations. Feel free to reach out and ask any of us if you have any questions, or would like to get further involved. Thank you.